Look at verse 8 and verse 9. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not gods. But now that you've come to know God, or rather to be known by God, jumps from the active to the passive, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world whose slaves you want to be once more? Now this is a very telling few verses. Let's read my commentary and see if I can make some sense of it. The passage that we're reading here in 8 and 9, verses 8 and 9, speaks of some of his readers turning back to those weak and miserable principles, a view supposed by historic Christianity to be a return to Judaism and the Torah of Moses. And to be sure, in the eyes of the church, these verses, which speak of the enslavement that Paul warns against, in the eyes of traditional Christianity, the enslavement here that Paul warns against in verse 9 is the bondage to ceremonial commandments such as Sabbath, circumcision, and the dietary restrictions and things like that. But can this really be the correct interpretation of weak and miserable principles? Is this really what Paul means by the weak and miserable principles? Let's keep reading and see if that's really what he means. I say in my commentary that elsewhere in Paul's letters, he actually calls the Torah itself holy, and the commandment holy and righteous and good. And that's in Romans chapter 7, verse 12, you can see from my footnote there. But I like to remind the Christians who teach that these must be the weak and beggarly principles, that the Torah must be that. How can Paul simultaneously call the Torah weak and miserable here in Galatians, and yet in Romans call it holy, just, and good? I think if we let the weight of Paul's teachings in Romans, and especially Colossians, if we let the weight of what he says about the Torah and about what he teaches about letting ourselves become subjugated to the elementary spirits of the world altogether in the stoicheon, I think if we let him talk about it there in another passage, then we're going to get a better understanding of what Paul really means by these weak and beggarly elementary principles of the world. Let's let the book of Colossians influence our interpretation of this passage here in Galatians. Let's let the two passages talk to one another, especially since they use the same Greek word, the stoicheon to kosmou, the elementary principles of the world. I think if we do that, then we're not going to fall for the historical trap of supposing that Paul is teaching some kind of a disparaging notion about the Torah, and yet at the same time teaching that it's holy, righteous, and good. And so let's not turn Paul into a schizophrenic person who doesn't really know what the Torah means. Instead, let's read Colossians and see if we can make a little bit of sense of this same phrase about the stoicheon to kosmou. It's amazing how similar these two passages are, the passage here in Galatians and the passage here in Colossians. And when we tie them all together, we can see the similarities, and I think it makes for a better application of these verses.